So, okay, we are supposed to go live now. So I've pressed the button. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we're live.
Okay. Okay. So it's on already.
I think so. Let me just double check
Right.
here. My phone. Yep.
Okay. So we can
Live.
then continue.
Huh?
Okay. Oh, so it's on.
Yeah.
Okay. So good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Adventist Colloquium on the Bible and Colonization. My name is Ayanam Dokwana, and I will be the one facilitating for this particular session. The person who was supposed to facilitate for the session was Sandile Busakwe, but unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, he will not be able to do so. So we would like to apologize for the inconvenience, and so we really hope that you will find it within your hearts to forgive us for this particular inconvenience. At this point in time, we are going to set out the house rules before we introduce the speaker for the day. The house rules are as follows. Firstly, the presentation is expected to be about 20 to 25 minutes long. And then after every presentation, there's going to be a 15-minute question and answer session. So if you want to ask any question to the speaker, feel free. It's an academic space. Yeah, this is your time. To introduce the speaker for this evening, our speaker for this evening is none other than Silakhe Singata. We usually call him my lord. He loves theology very, very much. If you know him, you'll know that he loves theology very, very much. He's a mentor to some of us informally. He completed his Bachelor of Theology degree at Heidelberg College of Higher Education. He then proceeded to do his Bachelor of Honors degree in Systematic Theology at Heidelberg College of Higher Education, and then he's currently doing his Master's degree at the University of South Africa, where he is currently also working. So we would like to welcome him. Ladies and gentlemen, less than human, rethinking Adventist apocalyptic pessimism. Silakhe Singata. Thank you very much, sir.
Wow, thank you. For a moment there, listening to that introduction, you think they're introducing like this seriously important president or whatnot, only to discover that this miserable nobody is standing before you all. But yeah, but on a more serious note, it's a privilege to, you know, have an opportunity to share some of these weird ideas that I come across and think about. So without wasting time, I mean, we do apologize about the time delays. I'll try to make this as concise as possible. And Ayanda, as the moderator, do not fear interrupting me when we have gone over the time. We need to respect people's time. Okay. So let me jump straight into it. Less than human, rethinking Adventist apocalyptic pessimism. Well, the first thing I'd probably want to say is one of my heroes, and I think the hero of many black South Africans, Steve Biko, has a slogan. He didn't come up with it, but in South Africa he's one of the people who popularized it. Black is beautiful. But today I have to ask, but is black really beautiful? Is my hero correct in asserting that black is beautiful? Is the black being a beautiful thing? And in order to reflect on this and think about the topic of less than human, I think the very first thing I want to talk about is being, and more precisely, human being. But let's begin with the question, what is being? What do we mean when we say being? The first thing I'll admit is that the term being is a very philosophically loaded term, and I have no interest in this particular occasion to hash out some sort of a genealogy of the word being. But I will say this, being is traditionally in philosophy thought to be the essential aspect of existence, the essential infinite aspect of existence. So in order to be clear on what being is, being itself, let's differentiate being from a being. So a being is something finite, whereas being is something infinite. A being is something contingent, whereas being is something essential. A being is the example, whereas being is the thing that a being is an example of. So there's a challenge, though, with being, without getting too carried away down the philosophical rabbit hole. There's a challenge with being, and that challenge is being is unavailable. We have no unambiguous, unmediated access to being. We can't even verify that being as the infinite essential aspect of existence is something that even exists. We can't touch being. We can't point to being. We can't measure being. What is being? All we have unmediated access to are beings. Maybe it's even incorrect to say we have unmediated access to beings, but let's say all we do actually have access to are beings, but we have no access to being itself. So we have access to different limited, finite, contingent expressions of what we think has an incontingent and unlimited underlying reality. But we can't confirm that there is an unlimited underlying reality behind this. So we have beings. To make this a little less abstract and to make this more clear and to situate it in a more South African context and to approach the topic of my discussion today, let's talk about two examples of being, two historical examples of beings, not being. And these two examples are the European human being and the African umtu. Now, these are two distinct ontological trajectories with two distinct histories. The notion of a human being is a European notion, whereas the notion of umtu is an African notion. Africans did not think of themselves they didn't even call themselves Africans pre-coloniality. In the pre-colonial era, the word African was not a word that was used by Africans. Africans referred to themselves, at least those whom I am a direct descendant of, they referred to themselves as abantu. And I would say this term abantu is an African equivalent of the European term beings or people. Okay, so human beings and abantu, there is some sort of an ontological overlap between those two categories, even if it is only at the level of these are the only two beings. Well, these are beings. Both of these are beings, and so the difference between beings and being, one major difference is that being, which is that which is thought to be infinite and unlimited, has no movement. It's the same now and always, even though we can't really verify any of this. Whereas beings are always in flux, transforming, moving, changing, becoming, always becoming. Beings are always changing. What it meant, for instance, to be umtu, let's say 3,000 years ago, is not the same thing it meant to be umtu 2,000 years ago. Just in that 1,000 year gap, the meaning and the unfolding of ubuntu shifted, because that is what beings are. As finite things, they move in historical time. They are in the flux of temporality, and they change and they keep on becoming. Now, some philosophers think that being, the capital letter B, the essential, infinite, metaphysical understructure of beings, well, they think being will one day be knowable when the unfolding of beings is complete. One day we will take stock of how all these different forms of being have unfolded and have been becoming and have been moving, and we'll say all of this together is being. But how can we even verify that? I'm not even going to try to. Let me leave the philosophical questions of whether or not being is something we can analyze or find. Because what I'm interested in is blackness, and whether or not, or the nature of black being. And from there we can move to apocalyptic questions. But in order to get to the point where we can discuss the nature of black being, one of the things I want to point out pretty early on is that the law is that which protects, the law as in legislation, is that which protects the unfolding and the becoming of being, of the human being. So the law, in the law promotes rights, human rights, ethics, and freedom for the human being. However, whose unfolding or whose being does the law protect? Remember, I mentioned two types of beings which are historical examples, and I trace them back to pre-colonial times. And these are the European human and the African umntu. Now, something shifted when coloniality took place. Something changed. I would say in both the European human and in the African umntu, something shifted. There was an ontological change that occurred, which would tell us whose being is protected by the law of these two beings. And here is the thing that changed with colonialism. What changed is that a new kind of existence was invented. And this new kind of existence is the black being. Now, I need to explain myself here, because some of you are probably thinking, what do I mean when I say the black being was invented during colonialism? When I just said myself that even before colonial times, there was an African form of being. Do not conflate the African being umntu with the black being, because the African being is that being that was not dispossessed. The African being is that being that was not colonized. The African being is that being that was not subjugated. But the black being enters history, if you allow me to use that sort of language, as an invention, as that which is dispossessed. The African becomes black through the act of dispossession. The African becomes black through the act of colonization. So colonization kills the African and in its place inserts the black. And the black is an ontological reminder of an onticide which took place, in which the African being was murdered. And the black is an ontological remnant of the onticide. The black is a perpetuation of the nullification of the being of the African. That is what it means to be black in the modern world, in the world after colonialism. This is how blackness enters the world. This is how the black being enters the world. So the black being is not exactly being. The black being lacks something. This is being which lacks being. So if you write black being, you would have to write black, and then when you write being, you'd have to scratch out the word being, because in truth, black being is not human being. It is equipment. It is existence. To exist as an instrument which helps those who actually do have being in their ontological project. So when the black being is invented through dispossession, the black being is turned into an instrument. We see two examples of this. The first example I'll mention but not discuss is the North Atlantic African American slave trade, which turns black African bodies of flesh into bodies, turns them into slaves. A slave is literally property. That is one of the first things it meant to be black when the concept of black being was invented, was a slave, property. When the African is killed and the black is invented, the black was property, apparatus, an instrument, a tool. On the other hand, here on the African shores, for those of us whose ancestors were left behind and not taken across the sea. Even though in the South African context, the black wasn't always a slave, we know that there were in the early times of colonialism examples of the Khoisan people being made slaves, but over and above that, the British did outlaw slavery, so black people were not held as slaves for the most part. However, they were slaves in all but name. Functionally, they were slaves. And I want to choose a very recent example to demonstrate my point. By recent, I'm talking in the 1970s when the apartheid South Africa legislated the notion of these homestands, these Bantu areas where black people would be citizens of these Bantustans, which means, technically speaking, they were not citizens of South Africa, but were citizens of their homestands. So in the Eastern Cape, we had the Transkei. We also know that there were the Zulu lands, just as two examples. And this sort of dispossession, this sort of exclusion from South Africa dates back pre-apartheid to the very first time Parliament was set up in South Africa, when the British were a part of it, and at a certain point, so were the Boers. The Boers were also a part of it, but Africans were never included in the beginning. So there has always, since coloniality up through apartheid, been this exclusion of the black thing, the former African, if I can say, from whatever it is that is South Africa. So whatever the law is protecting, it is not the black thing. Whatever the law is protecting, it is not black being. Instead, black being becomes the apparatus of white being. How in South Africa were blacks apparatus? Well, very shortly, this is how townships came to exist. Because if black people were deemed citizens of the Bantustans, but while white people still needed these black people to work for them, they still needed garden boys, they needed people to work for them on the farms, they needed workers in the factory, so they needed to give them some sort of access to South Africa. They needed to give them some sort of access to the land of the white man, to the space, to the world of the actual human. And so the township came to exist, and so did the Dompas. So even though these people were regarded as not belonging to the towns where they ended up living, they were allowed to just build up informal settlements for a limited amount of time, so long as they have a Dompas that proves that they are in South Africa to work. But should that time expire, they should leave and go back to the Bantustans. I know I'm generalizing broad strokes of history and I'm making huge jumps, but there isn't much I can do in the little time I have. The black person is included in South Africa, but in exclusion. Because the black thing is an instrument that the white man still needs to use for the white man's ontological project. So the white man now becomes the only one with being, with the human, who is a human, while the black is a thing, is an apparatus. Okay, without exhausting my time any further, there are just two more points I want to discuss. The first one is an anti-black world, question mark. Then the last point I'll discuss is apocalyptic pessimism itself. Well, the first point, I'll start with the first one and say, what I've basically been describing is the being of blackness. It is a being under erasure. You are a being that is not a being. You are nothing incarnated into human flesh. You are an instrument in human flesh. That is what it means to be black in modernity through colonialism. And what this historical trajectory brought into effect was the creation or the invention, not just of the black thing, but of an anti-black world. See, the world changed, at least as we experience it after colonialism. It changed and it became anti-black. First of all, the African was turned into the black, and then the world became anti-black. And what do we mean when we talk about the world as anti-black? Well, first of all, I'm not using the term world in any sense that it would be used in the hard sciences. I'm not talking about this rock that we call planet Earth. I'm talking instead about hermeneutical unity, a certain hermeneutical unit, a certain social construct which we call the world, a way in which we know the world to be. So if I could make an example of what I mean by social construct or invention, before, Isaac Newton, we say he discovered gravity, some say he invented gravity. I say technically Isaac Newton invented gravity. What I mean by that is, before Isaac Newton came up with a concept for the phenomenon that was happening in the world, which we try to make sense of through the notion of gravity, there was no such thing as gravity. Yes, there was a phenomenon which now is described through the concept of gravity, but in the absence of a concept to think of this phenomenon or to even recognize this phenomenon, so far as the world of human understanding is concerned, gravity did not exist. And in the same way, we create the world by conceiving it, by thinking it, by having layers of layers of meaning which overlap on top of each other as history progresses. I don't like the term progresses. As history moves forward or moves backwards or moves in zigzags, however history moves, as history moves, layers and layers fall on top of each other and create meanings and systems of meanings which we unknowingly inherit and continue to develop, which become the world, at least as we are able to conceive it collectively. This, however, is not, this conception of the world is all hermeneutical. It's interpretation. It's not something you can put under a microscope. It's culture. It's tradition. It's not science. That is the world. And during colonialism, the world and this unit, this hermeneutical unit, this phenomenological, multi-layered hermeneutical unit, this multifaceted hermeneutical unit became anti-black. So anti-blackness is a layered phenomenon, something that has been acquiring and accumulating layer upon layer from the moment it was of its inception in modernity up to this point. Anti-blackness is not something you can just change by removing one little aspect of legislation in that part of the Constitution, or by striking or by protesting and saying Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter protests doesn't work because in the world as we have inherited it, and in the world as we know it, and in the world that we are continuing to produce, Black lives do not matter. A world in which Black Lives Matter does not yet exist and never has. And nothing we see in the world today shows us that a world in which Black Lives Matter will exist anytime soon. There is no sign that Black lives will ever matter in the world, because the world as it has been constructed from the point of colonialism is to its deepest layer anti-black. Of course, that's just one trajectory or one thread of layers that I'm tapping on. The world is many other things apart from anti-black, but the anti-blackness of the world is so interfused and intertwined with other aspects of the layers which make up what we understand to be the world, that there is no way to rid the world of anti-blackness without ridding the world of its worldness. There is no way to undo anti-blackness without undoing the world. To put it in other terms, the destruction of anti-blackness is synonymous with the destruction of the world. Or, to put it differently, the world and anti-blackness are, for all intents and purposes, synonymous. Then the last point I come to is the apocalyptic pessimism and apocalyptic destruction. Well, in Seventh-day Adventism, there has always been a spirit of apocalyptic pessimism. And what I mean by this is, this has been a tendency to be pessimistic about the possibility of changing the world for the better through political interventions. Therefore, Seventh-day Adventists, to varying degrees, have, not all of them, but a significant number of them, I would dare to say even a majority, have tended historically to discourage political activity because of the belief that there is nothing that anyone can do in the political space or any other that will change the world for the better. And therefore, the only thing that will change the world is divine intervention in the form of a second coming of Christ, apocalyptic destruction. The world is unredeemable. The world will not change. And this Afro-pessimistic line that I've been drawing since I began speaking sort of, in a very interesting sense, overlaps with this Adventist apocalyptic pessimism about the ability to make an anti-black world a space which is habitable for black bodies. The world is inherently anti-black, and there is nothing about the world which will ever be hospitable to black people. That is why almost 30 years after the end of apartheid, people still live in the exact same shacks they lived in during apartheid. I was a pastor in a rural district for about 3 years, and whenever I would visit church members there, I remember there was a particular old man, an old couple, but the lady passed away, unfortunately. But I became quite close to this couple. They were in their 70s, both of them. And the old man said to me once, as I administered communion, after we finished that whole communion service and we were chatting, he said to me, "You know, Pastor, there's not much of a difference in the world as I experience it as I experienced it before the end of apartheid, and the world as I'm experiencing it today. Yes, there are differences. At least our children are not being shot in any sort of massacres, and we're not carrying dome buses whenever we go to East London or whatnot. But I still live in the exact same shack I lived in, Pastor. I only got electricity a couple of months ago. So, by the way, when I arrived to that district, they didn't yet have electricity. They only got electricity a couple of months after I became the pastor of that area. And I was thinking to myself, these are just maybe some more minor examples, less subtle examples of how nothing has really changed in any way that matters. Obagen, who spoke last night, spoke about how there is sort of a facelift that took place. There is a change that took place, a cosmetic change between the older South Africa and the current South Africa. But South Africa did not change in the ways that matter. And that point really struck home for me, and it brought back all these pastoral memories. I don't have enough time, because we're out of time. I've already pushed beyond the time that was promised. I don't have enough time to perhaps flesh out how we can explore the connections between Adventist apocalyptic pessimism and Afro-pessimism any further, and if there is any hope. But in closing, and I apologize that this is how I'm closing, and I'm leaving you with no hope. If you came here looking for good news, I'm sorry, I have no good news. I came here to give you bad news. But in closing, I want to go back to the statement I started with, which I came across through reading I Write What I Like from my hero, Steve Biko. Black is beautiful. Is black beautiful is the question I asked. And in the light of everything I've discussed above, my answer is no. Black is not beautiful, because what it means to be black in this anti-black world is onticide. It means the murder of the African. And it is a monument of onticide. Then the next question is, can black ever become beautiful in some point in the future? And to that I would have to say, perhaps, I don't know, perhaps, if blackness could be so deformed that it would be unrecognizable, if the world could be destroyed, but nothing we see or have ever seen for that matter gives us any reason to believe that that's going to happen. So any hope for a bright future for blackness is an unconditional hope which has no basis in anything we see in the anti-black world today. And it figures, why would an anti-black world promise anything positive for blackness? But perhaps we can hope against hope. I don't know. And that is where I'll cut it off. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, less than human, rethinking Advent apocalyptic pessimism. I don't know if we've got any questions, and if you've got any questions, you are free to ask any questions. The comments that we are getting is Nkosiyam. The second one is all is good. For me personally, it's a very interesting notion on blackness generally. And definitely, as you were busy presenting as well, I tried to figure out in the way in which you presented it to see how this would present to us as Adventists, or within how Black people would find themselves within Adventist theology. So it is definitely a concern, and we cannot run away from that. But it's a very challenging. It's quite something that is very challenging. I don't have any question. I'm also struck by what you have presented. I don't think there's any question. I'm trying to check if there's any other question. I can't seem to find any question. Let me just check. Yeah, so we don't have any question, but I definitely do think that what you have presented to us is a very interesting notion. Often the concept, let me not say the concept, but blackness is something that is always driven. There are different agendas towards blackness, so you always get these different concepts of what blackness actually is. So the concept that you have presented on what blackness actually is, particularly within our context of generally, is something that is a bit profound. And I think for me, it would be great for us to actually acknowledge blackness to a great extent within the Adventist context, in the way in which you have presented it, as a way of trying to save us, or create a theological framework that accepts blackness the way in which it is. So I don't think I've got any questions, but I definitely do appreciate the presentation.
Can I just say something? That's something that
Yeah.
when I present, I don't mention citations and all of that because that disrupts the flow of the presentation. But let me
Yeah.
perhaps mention some of the sources, because nothing I said here today is really original. Maybe the only original thing would be the connection between Afro-pessimism and Adventist apocalyptic pessimism, which I didn't even have time to flesh out any further. But
Yeah.
this is an idea that I get from the Afro-pessimist school of thought, particularly a book called Ontological Terror, written by Calvin Warren, a book that I picked up recently, and this is the shocking thing that I was introduced to, and nothing I see in the world tells me that he's wrong. But the point is not to dampen our spirits and to tell us that all is lost. But if we are ever going to change the world for the better, for the black person, we need to be realistic about what the world is to the black person currently. Because any fantasies about the world, any delusions, any rose decorated pictures of the world in blackness will not produce any liberation. That's why we will say Black Lives Matter until we are red in the face, and black people will keep dying even in South Africa, because black lives do not matter in an anti-black world. And yeah, but if we want to even consider or create an occasion where the possibility for black lives to matter to come forth, well, first we need to be realistic about the situation we're in. That's what Calvin Warren is all about, and he's one thinker who really helped me in that direction. Another would be Wilderson, but Frank Wilderson III, who came up with this school of thought, Afro-pessimism, and he came up with it with South Africa in mind. He may be an American theorist, but he was involved in the ANC during the downfall of apartheid, in the more radical wing of the ANC, working closely with people like Chris Hani. But when the more conservative wing of the ANC rose to prominence and apartheid fell, didn't fall, but it fell, he was basically in a situation where he had to get himself out of South Africa, because he had made enemies with people like Nelson Mandela because of his radical inclinations. And one of his colleagues in the ANC said to him, I asked him, where are you going now? And he said, I'll just go back to America and get an academic position. Then he said, Wilderson, in America, come up with some sort of theory that will help us so that this mess which took place through the compromise of the Codesa negotiations never occurs again. And that drove Wilderson to come up with Afro-pessimism. But that's just a brief little plug for Afro-pessimism. Thank you.
Sure. I would personally like to thank you for that presentation. At this point in time, we don't have any questions, but of course, we would definitely like to thank you for the presentation. I think it was wonderful. It did definitely make us think about Afro-pessimism, as you have said, and particularly within the Adventist realm, and maybe what we could draw from Afro-pessimism within our context. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks for having me, man.
It was super awesome to have you, and
Awesome.
in fact, we wish you nothing but the best.
Thank
So
you,
at
man.
this point in
Likewise.
time, we're going to conclude our meeting by saying, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the presentation. If you've got any questions outside of this particular time, maybe you're going to think about them, feel free to throw them, and we are going to see how we can maybe, I don't know if you'll be available, maybe free time, and then we can just throw maybe one question. So if you've got any question with regards to the presentation after tonight, please feel free to ask that question, and then we're going to see how we can forward that question to the presenter. Thank you very much to the presenter, and thank you, very much to the people who have watched. Join us tomorrow, same time, same place, with Pastor Stu Blosse and Khaki Esi Kabiwa. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, man. Sure.
Bye.
Sure. Umza. Yeah? Okay, let me switch it off.